Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Spillane, and I am your chair for this session, session 3C. So the title of this session is Offsite Construction. So this afternoon we have three papers, the first of which is On-Site Manufacturing Research. It's a systematic review of methodologies used. Our second paper is the analysis of skill shortages in prefabricated residential construction, and it's a case from a New Zealand perspective. The third is dynamic supply chain vulnerability analysis of Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macao bridge construction. So we're going to take each in turn, where after each presentation we will open the floor from questions from those in attendance. So what we will do is, as the video comes to a conclusion, I will bring in anyone in attendance who is affiliated with the paper, where they will be given the opportunity to answer questions on the presentation and also answer questions from those in attendance. So with that, we will begin with the first presentation.
So thank you for the opportunity to present at this
Someone confirm that you can hear
conference.
that.
I'm presenting on a paper titled Offsite Manufacturing, a systematic review of the methodologies used. The outline of the presentation will follow this format. The background to this paper came from the fact that whilst there is a long-standing methodological debate in the SEM literature generally, for example, scholars have highlighted the battle for paradigm dominance. Others have also pointed to the fact that there are ontological biases in all SEM research, and it's important to emphasize them. Others have also highlighted the limited use of theory or theoretical contributions coming from SEM literature, whilst more recently there are also issues regarding the fact that there's increasing use of modeling in SEM literature. Offsite manufacturing is a domain of SEM literature that has gained prominence recently in both academic scholarship but also among policymakers. However, we've noticed that these methodological debates that started in the wider SEM literature hasn't played out in the OSM literature that is emerging. So the purpose of this research was to be able to explore the extent to which these methodological issues have been engaged with in the OSM literature. We were interested in understanding what research methods are being used, the design, the data sources, the analytical techniques that are employed. How do these relate to what we have observed in the wider SEM literature? And then also to be able to see what is the extent of use of theory in the OSM literature. We drew on a systematic review. Data was gathered through database search. We used corpus. 9 keywords related to offsite manufacturing were employed. 160 abstracts of potentially relevant articles were reviewed, and finally 74 journal articles were considered relevant and then thoroughly reviewed, looking at the methodologies that have been employed in there and also the use of theory. In terms of our findings, we found out that quantitative methods still dominate OSM literature, with 43% of the literature adopting quantitative methods, followed by qualitative method and mixed method in that order. This is consistent with observation by Dainty. However, this also departs from what Ajiko Mensah observed, that is rather qualitative method that is dominant in SEM literature. The possible difference between our findings and previous studies is the fact that ours focus exclusively on OSM, while others look at SEM literature more generally. In terms of thematic areas, we wanted to understand the extent to which different themes are aligned to some research methods, and the findings reveal that indeed there are some themes that are more likely to adopt some methods than others. So for example, studies that focus on component production as a theme are more likely to adopt quantitative methods as opposed to other forms of research methods. The same goes for example, studies that are policy oriented. They are likely to adopt qualitative methods rather than other research methods. Looking at the use of theory, as Beth and Lansley has highlighted, we noticed that there was a limited use of theory, with only just 15% of the literature we reviewed employing theory. But however, in terms of conceptual framework, about 2/3 of the literature adopted a conceptual framework. This goes to confirm the observations that have been made earlier on in the wider SEM literature, that there's still a limited use of theory in the literature, and then we are seeing this play out also in the OSM literature. Now, among the few studies that have even used theories, we realize that if you look at them in terms of research methods, mixed methods were the method that employed theory the most, whilst qualitative method employed theory the least. The same kind of pattern is repeated where we see qualitative method underrepresented in the use of conceptual framework, whilst quantitative method dominates the use of conceptual framework, which also confirms the observation that we are seeing more conceptual frameworks playing out in quantitative methods in the wider SEM literature. In terms of research designs, there were both standalone research design and then what we call hybrid research design, where scholars will employ more than one different research design. Taken all together, case studies emerged as the dominant research design, accounting for about 26% of the literature reviewed. It's dominant in both standalone, but also even in terms of hybrid, because most of the designs would combine with case studies. Now, in terms of data sources, there were a plurality of data sources. Bibliometric database emerged as the dominant data source, but then we found evidence of data sources that sit within qualitative and quantitative. So, for example, there were use of interviews, there were use of focus group discussions, but then taken together is bibliometric database that emerged as the dominant qualitative methodology. And we see qualitative data source, pardon me, and we see this play out both also in terms of standalone and also in hybrid research designs. In terms of analytical techniques, there was a clear dominance of quantitative analytical techniques. So modeling emerged as the dominant analytical technique for quantitative oriented research, whilst content analysis dominated those that are qualitative inclined. And this once again reinforces the notion about the quantitative bias of SEM literature, and we are seeing this playing out in the OSM literature. So taken together, our finding point to a certain path dependency in the growing scholarship on OSM. Why? Because we still see the dominance of quantitative methods. We see the dominance of quantitative analytical techniques.
Okay, so thank you very much. That's a very interesting presentation, particularly given the lean towards a more quantitative approach on offsite manufacturing research. So just before I open the floor, I should have both Richmond and Kwadwo brought to presenter roles, so you should have the option to turn off your mic and also turn on your video should you so wish. Just seeing, if anyone has any question, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand and I can bring you in as well. But just while we're waiting for that, just a very quick point. There's a few things. Number one, you just looked at Scopus as your primary and only source of literature. Was there a specific reason for not looking at, say, JSTOR or some other databases available to you, or what was the justification for just using that single source?
All right. Can you hear me?
I can.
Good. So Scopus was not the only database we used. In fact, we did a preliminary research in about 4 different databases, including Scopus, and the preliminary results, keying in the word offsite manufacturing, we realized that it was Scopus that returned the highest number. So
okay,
yeah, we thought because it had the highest database, it's important to go with that. And we cross-referenced some of the literature, and you could see that some of the literature that we find in the others are also captured in Scopus. So we tried as much not to miss any of the literature, but
okay,
Scopus had the largest database.
Okay, good. The other thing and obviously you were at length in stating that the vast majority of literature on this is primarily quantitatively based. Do you think that us as researchers in this area, that we're somewhat missing a large, particularly when we look at quantitative or qualitative research, it can be very rich and in depth. Do you think that maybe we're missing an opportunity to delve into this topic further, given the lack of research done on a qualitative viewpoint?
To some degree, I would say yes, but I also understand the point that unlike other established domain, offsite manufacturing, although has been around for a long time, but it seems it is quite recently that it's gaining a lot of traction in both scholarly and also policy discourse. And there is that imperative to be able to make a strong case for its uptake. And oftentimes scholars, I would argue, feel a bit compelled to provide the numbers to convince people, because they are trying to sort of unseat the traditional way of construction, right? So the numbers will back up the argument, cutting down waste, reducing time it takes to complete projects, reducing accidents. All these figures are part of a bigger agenda to be able to demonstrate that there is much value in the uptake of, and that is why we don't tend to see so much qualitative research dominating. I think my colleague Kwadwo will probably add a line or two.
Yes, I think in addition to what Richmond has mentioned, the domain is a subset of what we are. The findings is a subset of what has been observed in other studies that have taken into consideration the wider CEM literature, and so it is not very surprising for studies to also continue replicating the methodological position of the wider construction engineering and management literature.
Yeah, I think yes, and I think you've really hit the point there that somewhat researchers are somewhat, I wouldn't say afraid, but reluctant to move away from the standard norm relative to what has been done in previous practices. So given there you referenced like Svandi Dainty and the work done where they've been, largely quantitative in their orientation. Therefore, some would use the argument that if it isn't broken, well, why fix it? But then who is to argue that maybe it isn't a broken process for data collection, that we're just using a quantitative method? And from my perspective, I can see the argument of why one would use a quantitative method, where it's a lot harder to argue against figures and percentages rather than an individual's viewpoint or perception based on a specific moment in time. So obviously, if you interview somebody on a Monday morning versus a Friday afternoon, their options or their viewpoints, very often change. However, if you look at the literature on it, even though it's quantitatively based, it may be done so on the back of, say, a questionnaire or a quantitatively derived medium. So I know you mentioned there again the mixed method approach on it. So I understand where you're coming from on it, but I think having seen that, and it's a paper I will look at, in that I think we are missing an opportunity, and people are more comfortable by tracking the norm rather than doing something that maybe would be somewhat off center relative to what is the norm. But no, I think it does open and maybe provides a justification for further research and for further researchers in this area to say, I'm going to do a mixed method or purely qualitative approach. And one of the real justifications of that is your paper, in saying that, look, where's the gap in knowledge? But it's evident from what you've seen and the data that you've collected that we may have somewhat exhausted, although I understand quite what you're saying about this being a relatively new discipline, a relatively new area. But already it seems somewhat exhausted on the quantitative perspective. Just I don't want to take all your time. Just I'm going to give the those in attendance again. If anyone has any question or any comment or anything they'd like to add to the discussion, please feel free to either raise your hand or put it into the chat, and where I can invite you in either in person, or if you want, we can just read out your comment or your question as well. Just looking, there's nothing else there. And look, as you said, this is relatively new. Do you find that the results of what you have alluded to in this paper and your presentation, are you surprised by them? That people are relying on I won't say hard data, but figures relative to getting people's opinions or perceptions. Do you find that somewhat surprising, given that, like offsite manufacturing, some of the real benefits of doing it are buried within the knowledge of those whom you speak with in industry? So are you somewhat surprised that maybe there isn't a more of an even split for both, say, mixed methods or looking at a qualitative approach?
I would say I'm not surprised. This is a long-standing debate, and the battle for paradigm dominance is one that it's not just within construction research and management. In other disciplines, this debate is still ongoing, and it is often the case that we tend to elevate or valorize quantitative inclined or positivistic thinking against other forms of thinking. But we should also emphasize that this research the agenda is not to sort of try to say cast down quantitative research or criticize quantitative research. It's just for us to be critical of what is there, what we have found. If we had found that qualitative research was a dominant one, we would still ask the question, why is it the case that qualitative research is dominant? And therefore, because what our view is that the construction industry, and indeed SEM research, is quite complex, and the subject we are contending with is heavily debated whether it is very scientific or it's very much of a social science. So all these arguments are there, and therefore the literature must reflect this diversity and these different ontological positions. But then if we get to see only literature that are very much quantitative inclined, then for young researchers and policymakers, there will seem to be a certain unspoken assumption that this field is very quantitative and is very numbers inclined, and it can potentially prevent other novel ways we could have understood what is happening within the construction industry, and that is what we want to bring out. But we are not surprised by this finding that we see. Yeah.
Colin Booth there in the chat, you've alluded to it there in your last statement, where he asked the question: do articles express their philosophical stance to underpin their choice of their research strategy? So was there a solid justification for a repeated use of purely quantitative, or did you see much of a justification in that regard?
So one of the things you will find in the presentation, particularly in the graphs, is a large number of studies that are marked unspecified.
Yes.
And most of the studies don't clarify what their research design is, what their method is, what they don't. And they have a certain assumption that people will know. So it is also one of the things we highlighted in a full paper that is coming out in CME very soon, that this is an issue, because if scholars don't make it very clear what the justification is, the ontological position, why this particular approach justifies the research question, then it's going to be a problem. And authors and editors should be able to look at this more critically, so that there will be that very robust kind of research, and people who will draw on this research will be able to validate the robustness of the evidence that are presented. So yes, some do, but some also don't sort of make it very clear what their epistemological view and also their ontological positions are.
And building on what Richmond has said, Sherat and Leicht recently wrote a paper about unpacking ontological perspectives, where essentially they make the argument that in some of, whereas in the wider CM literature, there are biases in the philosophical stances that are chosen, and how all of these influence the research that we conduct in the field. in more often than not in the CM literature, researchers tend not to explicitly state their philosophical stance. Yeah. Neither do they make it. But then it takes some engagement with that piece of literature to be able to tease out a likely philosophical stance that might have guided the study, and it's going to be a critical. And doing that requires a critical engagement with the studies that have been conducted, and that's one of the points that we make in the journal paper that Richmond mentions. And so we try to make that point and state that going forward, in order to move away, in order to broaden the insights we've gathered about offsite manufacturing literature, we ought to critically interrogate the existing knowledge, the research that is being conducted, in order to critically identify where we want to take the research to and what is informing that angle of research.
Yes, I think, and Isaac hit it there, in that we need to challenge as researchers the viewpoint that, it's implied this is what we're doing. Rather, we need to very much clarify, as Isaac put in the chat, our philosophical stance, and be very explicit and clear and coherent to the reader of this is why, like, who is to argue that a quantitative approach isn't the most appropriate? But again, to see that justification is best placed and that it is the best route forward relative to studying the topic of OSM. Okay, I'm very conscious of time, and I really enjoyed that. And I think, particularly for people going down what, as you say, is a relatively new area within CM research, and it is one that is worthy of investigation, particularly as an awful lot of our traditional base approach moves towards a more OSM viewpoint. But again, with that, I just want to thank you very much for taking the time to take questions on your presentation. And it's a paper I will be looking at, and obviously, as you made reference to, you have a future journal coming on it. So again, I think that will strengthen the argument, if not just for OSM, but for all studies, of having a very explicit viewpoint relative to why you're undertaking the research in the way that you propose. But with that, folks, just say thank you again very much, and we will move on to the second presentation. So thank you.
Thank you, John.
So our second presentation is the analysis of skills shortages in prefabricated residential construction, a case study for New Zealand.
Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to our research project presentation. The title of the project is Analysis of Skill Shortages in Prefabricated. From the School of Built Environment at Massey University, New Zealand. And the other co-researchers of this project are Firas and Funmilayo from AUT University, Auckland, New Zealand. Let's talk about a little bit of the background of our research project. As we are aware that affordable and acceptable quality housing has been one of the biggest issues across the world, and same in New Zealand. Getting an affordable house with higher quality is a really huge challenge. One of the reasons for this challenge is that we don't have enough skills in the construction industry. Also, the traditional construction method seems ineffective, seems slow, also generate a lot of waste, and increasing housing supply is really challenging with the traditional construction methods. Therefore, a lot of past researchers have introduced prefabrication as a solution to affordable housing, as well as a new construction method to reduce construction waste and carbon emission as well. So in prefabrication, it has been widely used across the world. As you can see in this slide, countries like Germany, Japan, Sweden, about 20% of new builds are, new builds use prefabrication in Germany, about 15% in Japan, and 85% in Sweden. However, in comparison to the rest of the world, New Zealand's use of prefabrication is lower. It's about 17%. I think one of the reasons for not having sufficient amount of prefabricated construction in New Zealand is that we don't have the skilled workers to, install buildings. So this research aims to identify what sort of skills are required and, how to attain these prefabricated related skills to promote prefabrication to increase the housing supply in New Zealand. In New Zealand, the role of research and design is really important in prefabrication technology. So both the designers and constructors, the builders, need to be aware of this technology in terms of how to design for prefabricated buildings and how to install buildings using prefabricated components. Also, obviously, it will increase the health and safety of the construction sector as there is less site work involved with this technology. So the skill shortages in traditional construction sector, in comparison to prefabrication, is one of the issues here. So in this study, we try to increase the awareness of the skill shortages in the supply chain, focusing on the prefabrication. Also, we want to promote uptake of prefabrication technology, particularly in the residential sector. So after conducting a comprehensive literature review, the research identified the key research gaps. As you can see on the screen, the aim of this research is to bridge the gaps identified over here. So first one is to prioritizing key issues associated with skill shortage in the residential prefabrication sector, and then identify fundamental constraints impacting wide acceptance of prefabrication industry. Also as essential measures to increase the prefabrication uptake in the New Zealand housing supply chain as demonstrated here. And finally, defining essential skills required in New Zealand prefabrication residential sector. So these were the research gaps identified. The research aim of this study is to attempt to address the potential skill shortages and barriers in the prefabrication industry in New Zealand that could impact the desirable transformation from traditional in situ construction to more prefabricated-led construction methods. So the objectives were categorized into 3 clusters, and research questions were defined to address the research objectives identified here. So first objective was to explore the essential skill requirement, and then secondly, to identify the barriers for implementing prefabrication, and finally, to determine the measures that could be implemented to increase the prefabrication uptake. So these were the 3 objectives defined, and the respective research questions used in the study also are explained on the right-hand side. And in terms of the research approach, the research methodology for the current study is mixed method approach, We conducted questionnaires that had both open-ended and closed-ended questions, both qualitative and quantitative questions, and we administrated this questionnaire using Qualtrics online platform. And we received 47 responses from different construction stakeholders, and we conduct both statistical descriptive analysis as well as content analysis to draw conclusions out of the findings. And this is a sample questionnaire that we use in Qualtrics. As you can see, the initial questions were more about quantitative questions, and people were asked to, put their opinions in terms of they agree or disagree. The last couple of questions were open-ended. We asked the people's opinions on the questions. And the results were then tabulated, and we had a lot of responses from New Zealand Institute of Buildings, and we also had responses from other organizations such as New Zealand Institute of Architects, Project Management Institutes, etc., as you can see. And we had quite a lot of experienced people responded in this study. Some other demographics information over here as well. So let's look at more demographic information. Let's look at the key findings. So we found that in terms of skill shortage in residential prefabrication sector, we identify the key skills required. So we found that recruiting prefabrication specific skilled workers, recruiting labor with multiple skills, recruiting overseas laborers, recruiting adequacy of training placement in the industry were identified as one of the key findings using the descriptive statistical analysis. And the highest...
Okay, so I'm just waiting on the presenter of paper 2. If the presenter of paper 2 can make themselves known by putting a response in the chat, I can promote you to presenter, and you can turn on your microphone to take questions on the presentation. So with that, have we anyone to take questions on the presentation that we have just seen? Just looking through the list of delegates available in the room, and I don't see anybody. I'll just give it a moment. Yes, Isaac, a good presentation would be great, because I've actually a number of questions on this, particularly given that it's a New Zealand study. I don't think they're unique in the viewpoint that we have a bit of a skills shortage. I think it's a global issue, and whether prefabricated residential construction is the solution or not. Have we Firas or any of their colleagues in the room? I'll just give it another moment just to give them an opportunity. They may have a connection issue. We'll just give it one more moment. And if we don't have anybody regretfully to take questions, we'll have to move on to the third presentation. So again, if there's anybody available to take questions on the second presentation, if you can please step forward by confirming in the chat. Yes, and as Colin has rightfully pointed out, one of his previous studies, he identified over 128 barriers to offsite construction in the literature. And to be honest, Colin, I don't think that was exhaustive. It is a very significant issue in relation to the uptake of prefabricated construction. If anyone has any comments they would like to make or any other viewpoints, please do feel free to put them in the chat. I have a raised hand. Now, Isaac, you should have an opportunity to be able to turn on your mic, and if you wish, you can turn on your camera.
Can you hear from me?
Hi, Isaac. How are you?
I'm good. Can you hear from me?
I can indeed. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, it's very late here, so.
Where are you based, Isaac? Oh, you're in Sydney. Okay. Thank you very much for staying with us.
Okay, yeah, my question is, I wanted to find out from the presenter, did they undertake a thorough literature review? And if they did the literature review focus on only New Zealand or global? They undertook a global review, sorry. Was the literature review a global review, or it was specifically to only New Zealand?
Yeah. Again, we're waiting for the speaker. Unfortunately, we haven't got somebody here with us, but I would assume it would have been a global viewpoint to bring it into context. But again, we're unsure. We have Richmond. Richmond, again, you should have an opportunity to turn on your microphone.
Thank you. Thank you, John.
No problem.
Yeah, I was just keen to understand when he talks about skills in the construction industry, is there a specific aspect of the construction value chain that these skill shortages become evident? It didn't come out clear in the presentation. I was wondering.
Yeah, and again, it's from our own context in the UK and Ireland, we've a skill shortage right across the entire spectrum of skill of trades, etc., and even down to semi-skilled individuals as well. So yes, it would be good, and maybe that's detailed further in the paper. So before I move on, we have another minute or two. Just want to see if the speaker or the presenter has had an opportunity to join us. And if they have, please do make themselves known. They might be able to answer just one or two of the quick questions from either Richmond or Isaac. Okay, we don't. So unfortunately, we have nobody to take our questions on this paper. So Isaac, Richmond, both thank you very much for coming forward, and the points you make, again, it would be great to get a little bit more clarity on them, but unfortunately, we don't have somebody here to provide that clarity for us. So with that, I'm going to move on to the third and final presentation. I'm very conscious of time, and that is dynamic supply chain vulnerability analysis of Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macao bridge construction, a topic modeling approach.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Anushika Ekanayake. Today, I'm going to present one of the outcomes generated during my PhD research on dynamic supply chain vulnerability analysis of Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macao bridge construction using a topic modeling approach. This work is co-authored by Professor Geoffrey, Shen, Professor Mohan, Kumaraswamy, and Dr. Shen. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to touch the background of the study, aim, research methods, result generated, expose supply chain vulnerability evaluation map developed with the conclusions. Moving to the study background, the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macao Bridge was a challenging milestone construction project that boosted the Hong Kong construction industry to new heights of recognition. Actually, this is the longest bridge tunnel sea crossing in the world, and this is 55 kilometers long. This is located at the Pearl River entrance, and this connects three metropolises of Hong Kong, Zhuhai, and Macau. The design and construction of the bridge included 3 navigable bridges, 1 immersed tunnel, and 2 artificial islands. Given the specific project location, challenging construction conditions, high quality requirements of the project, longer service life requested, and the safety concerns due to aviation and maritime routes, this study preferred prefabricated construction. Accordingly, the construction included prefabricated piers, pile caps, girders, steel box, and immersed tube tunnels. They were produced in factories and delivered for on-site assembly through maritime routes. With this arrangement, all the main tunnel elements were prefabricated under standardized management systems. Therefore, labor, material, and time on site were significantly reduced by this method, and great efficiency, safety, and quality could be achieved. However, these innovative construction methods, advanced technology, and equipment injected a new set of challenges, adding further complexities and vulnerabilities to the project supply chain. Especially, the installation of these elements was a complicated and time-consuming task, as the elements were very heavy, while the installation of those heavy elements was affected by the meteorological and hydrological conditions on site. Under these circumstances, the project overran its timeline and the actual budget. Then, why we need supply chain resilience in this regard? Because the mentioned challenges demanded closer attention to effective vulnerability management mechanisms, and traditional risk management strategies were inadequate in withstanding all these supply chain vulnerabilities. We have already observed this in this project. Indeed, such fragmented prefabricated supply chains call for advanced risk management mechanisms to cope efficiently with project vulnerabilities. Also, deploying stronger and appropriate capability measures would have boosted resilience by more effective withstanding ability. To become resilient, proper identification of dynamics of supply chain vulnerabilities is the first step. Therefore, this study we have aimed to develop an exposed supply chain vulnerability evaluation map by introducing topic over time modeling as a novel method for supply chain vulnerability analysis with the use of Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macao Bridge project. Why we have used TOT modeling? Because it facilitates dynamic and objective analysis, and considering the other text mining techniques, this method is considered to be more effective because this captures the low-dimensional data structures, and also this detects the structures changes. Here you can see the research methods used and the flow of this study. We have downloaded project documents from the official website of the Hong Kong Legislative Council, and the downloaded data were then gone through cleaning process, and then we could extract highly relevant documents. The extracted documents were then undergone through TOT modeling. Thereby, we could generate 6 featured word sets. After conducting coherence testing for the featured word sets, we could develop 6 topics, and then we determine the critical supply chain vulnerabilities using these 6 topics, and we have identified their trend as well. Also, we mapped the results with supply chain phases and finally developed the exposed supply chain vulnerability evaluation. Moving to the results, we have identified 6 critical vulnerabilities associated with Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macao Bridge and their dynamics as well. You can clearly see them in this picture. In this project, the planning was between 2003 to 2009, the construction was between 2010 to 2017, and project handed over in 2018. According to the dynamic impacts of identified vulnerabilities, the project had encountered all the vulnerabilities during the planning phase, as you can see in this picture. In mega infrastructure development such as this project, manufacturing of the prefabricated components is quite expensive and the production cycle is also much longer. Of course, economies of scale were there, but unavailable when using customized and non-standardized elements such as immersed tubes and steel box girders. Also, much time was spent on planning and design. However, the project was highly disrupted by outsourcing issues in the construction phase. The cross-border related issues were also high in the construction phase because the construction phase involved the transportation of prefabricated components across customs and immigration control borders. When reaching the handover phase, transportation vulnerabilities, economic and social disruptions, and communications issues were reduced because of additional efforts to reap the imminent societal benefits from this project. The 6 topics and their popularity trend outputs generated from the TOT modeling were mapped with the prefabricated supply chain phases of manufacturing, logistics, and on-site assembly to develop this exposed supply chain vulnerability evaluation map. Considering the vulnerability dynamics, the on-site assembly was the most vulnerable supply chain phase, as you can see here, and the logistic phase was also associated with significant vulnerabilities as there were specific disturbances due to prefabricated elements transportation. Moving to the conclusions, we have identified 6 critical topics of vulnerabilities. Accordingly, we have developed a decision-making map, and this is the first known study that developed such kind of a supply chain vulnerability evaluation map using the topic over time modeling approach, and this is the first attempt to evaluate vulnerabilities associated with infrastructure projects targeting resilience. The limitations I would like to bring forward with future research directions: improved mapping through more data without just considering single case study would enhance the results. Also, since supply chain resilience, especially the capabilities and vulnerabilities, are jurisdiction specific, new studies could be conducted according to your countries. Also, the study for supply chain vulnerability capability correlationship analysis would be highly beneficial if we are considering the main term of resilience, and improved results through sentiment analysis would provide much robust supply chain vulnerability evaluation. Moving to the research significance, the outcomes depicted in the map provide a managerial guide to the industry professionals, and the industry practitioners would benefit from prior knowledge of potential vulnerabilities and their dynamic impact on each project and supply chain phase, so they may prioritize how to address these vulnerabilities better through appropriate capability development in each supply chain phase. More importantly, the text mining approach adopted in this study unveils and applies novel vulnerability analysis methods while pointing academia to an effective mechanism to extract empirical clues from a large unstructured set of documents in the construction domain in general. Thank you very much for listening my presentation today. Your valuable comments, questions, and suggestions are mostly welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a very good presentation on dynamic supply chain vulnerability analysis, again, using a very specific case study. So Anushika, I have you promoted to presenter role, so you should have the opportunity to be able to turn on both your mic and your camera, should you so wish.
Hello, John. I'm already
Hi.
there. Can you see me?
I can indeed. Thank you very much for joining us, particularly given your location. So I know it's probably a bit late. So what I'll do is I'll open it up to the chat, or if anyone wants to raise their hand, they can do so. And I can bring you in as a presenter as well. Okay, I have an individual. So Isaac, you should have a request to turn on your microphone.
Hi.
Hi, yes, Isaac, your question, please.
Yeah, my question is once again on literature review. When she was presenting, she made mention of they taking some documents from, I think, Hong Kong something institute. So I wanted to know, apart from the document that we took from them, did you undertake a literature review from Scopus or Web of Science or something?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Actually, the data were from original sources, original project documents, and Hong Kong Legislative Council is the appropriate body or the governing body for Hong Kong Zhuhai-Macao bridge construction project. So they have recorded and presented the original project documents, and they have published them in their on their website. So we could luckily download all these documents. There were around 1,748 documents. All those records presented the meeting documents and other project related documents of Hong Kong Zhuhai-Macao bridge construction. And that is the importance of this research work actually, because we could use the originally completed set of documents, which includes the actual data of the construction project. So it is quite a case study, and it is not Web of Science, Google Scholar, or any kind other searching database. Thank you very much for your question.
Okay, thank you. I think my question is well answered, because since you are undertaking this thing on a specific project, I think and looking at the number of documents too that you download, I think it's good enough to do this. So thank you. Well done.
Thank you very much.
Isaac, thank you very much. And Hasni also acknowledges a very interesting piece of research, which I would also agree with. And one of the interesting aspects I found from your presentation was your matrix, where you identified the delivery and the construction phase as being, for the want of a better phrase, the pinch point relative to the supply chain vulnerability that you identified in your case study. But also it was very good to see that you acknowledged the limitation in the research, in that it is very case study specific, and that some of your findings may not be replicable in other instances. Say, for instance, you had issues of geographical boundaries of one region to another, etc., etc. So it really brings me back to the question then is, why did you pick that particular case study? Was it because of the magnitude of construction, or the potential array of what could be an exhaustive list of stakeholders, or what was your reason in the very first instance for picking that case study?
Yeah, the very first thing is that it is quite a massive construction project, and it received the high recognition from not only from Hong Kong, Zhuhai and Macau construction industries, but also all around the globe. The eminent attention is received for this construction project. And on the other hand, it is quite a mega construction project, and we could see many stakeholders involvement there, and we could learn some failures and successes, both failures and successes from this construction project. And luckily, the details and the project documents were available on the website. So that was another reason behind selecting this mega construction project, John.
Okay. And given that this is obviously a very substantial project, do you think there is a potential to replicate your findings on, I won't say smaller projects, but obviously which would still be significant projects? Do you think there is a replica, we could replicate some of your findings, or do you think these are very case study specific findings?
Honestly, I believe this is very specific findings for this project. So this is kind of a exposed supply chain vulnerability evaluation map, and the tool and the software that we develop to analyze the results and everything we can use in any kind of other construction projects. So we can use this supply chain vulnerability evaluation model in ex-ante decision making as well. So I think this is not only for the method, and the tool developed is not only for this specific case study, but the findings are, of course, specific to Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macao Bridge.
Of course. And again, Kwadwo very aptly comes in with something very similar in relation to the transferability. Again, a perfect example, yes, the likes of HS2 in the UK, etc. There would be opportunities to learn from your findings of your research. And did you have the opportunity to present your findings to the authorities relative to the bridge construction, or is it something that you think that maybe they would be interested in?
Of course, if we have enough data, we can proceed with data analysis. So actually, the second author of this paper, he involved in mathematical modeling and evaluation part. So we can jointly work if he's willing to join with that. So we are more than happy if we can help in that way.
Perfect. And again, obviously, given that particularly in the construction industry that our supply chains are dynamic would be somewhat of an understatement in relation to the complexity. Again, as one of the attendees said, the likes of HS2, I think there is a very much a transferability that we can use to learn from, I won't say the mistakes made, but the opportunities that we can gain from identifying in advance vulnerabilities within our supply chain. Because with our previous case study, even with the likes of prefabrication, skill shortages, etc., our supply chain, if it's ineffective, will result in a detrimental outcome in our projects. So I think that the three presentations we've had this afternoon in this session are very much aligned relative to how important our supply chain is, both in identifying and dealing with skill shortages, but more so in dealing with very complex and dynamic projects, particularly in the case study that you have used. So before, we've just got a moment, we've got approximately 2 minutes remaining, just to give an opportunity for those, if anyone else has any questions or comments or anything before we close. Just to give a last opportunity. Okay, has anyone any other comments or anything else? So just before we close on it, just a very fine line, a very quick question on it. Do you think if we had a similar project today, given the complexity, again, the likes of HS2, do you think that these findings would be replicated regardless of the geographical location? So even if we've got a mega project or a very significant endeavor, that in the majority, the issues would resonate with our supply chain around the areas of construction and delivery. Do you think that would be the case regardless of the complexity of the project or the location?
Of course, I mean the supply chain and the supply chain configurations are jurisdiction specific. But if we argue in that way, we cannot use any kind of a case study outputs for future use. But I think there are some similarities, core communities exist, so we can take the advantage from those core communities, and these things we can consider. Yeah,
that's brilliant. And with that, I just note we're coming to 4 p.m. and I really do want to keep the time, given that we have a number of sessions and I know people are trying to take breaks in between. So with that, I want to thank you very much, Anushika, for your presentation and particularly as well to Richmond as well, and Kwadwo for making themselves available. So again, apologies, we had nobody to take questions on our second presentation. Again, a very interesting presentation, and one I think that really resonates not just in New Zealand, but internationally. So with that, I just want to thank you all for attending, and in particular, those of you who have taken and also have provided questions and debate to these papers. Again, thank you all very much.